This is a mescaline trip report by Russ, posted to Erowid.org on May 2nd, 2018. I have been curious about entheogens for 6 years. My first encounter was with mushrooms when I was 14. That first experience left a mark, and over the next decade I collected about 7 more mushroom trips. I have also taken MDMA on roughly 6 occasions, and I have used DMT 14 times. Marijuana has been a constant companion for most of my adult life. When I first tried San Pedro, I followed the traditional recipe for a boiled soup. The result was a thick, bitter sludge that tasted like dirt and left a sour aftertaste that lingered for hours. The process required me to cut the cactus into sections, strip the spines, boil the flesh, strain, boil again, and strain again. The whole routine felt like a chore, and the final product did not give me the depth of experience that I expected for the time I spent. After a few failed attempts, I decided to look for a more efficient way to obtain mescaline. I found a vendor on the internet who sold powdered San Pedro for $99 per 900 grams. The powder arrived in a sealed bag, grayish in color with a faint earthy smell. I read several extraction guides and chose the method that promised the highest yield with the least amount of equipment. The procedure involved mixing the powder with an acid solution, filtering, then precipitating the mescaline with a base. After several hours of stirring, filtering, and evaporating, I ended up with 2 to 3 grams of mescaline hydrochloride in a crystalline form. I pressed the crystals into 8 small grayish-black pills, each about the size of a grain of rice. My intention for this night was simple. I wanted to explore the visual side of mescaline, to see how the colors of the world would shift, and to listen to the quiet thoughts that usually sit behind the noise of daily life. I also hoped that the experience would give me a fresh perspective on the stories I have heard about shamanic practices. I told my 2 friends, Amy and Tony, that I was planning to take the pills. Tony agreed to take 3 of the pills, and I took 5. It was 10 o'clock in the evening. The sky over northwest Arkansas was a deep indigo, dotted with a scattering of stars that seemed to pulse with a quiet energy. The air was warm, and the night insects sang in a low chorus. Amy, Tony, and I sat in the living room of a friend's house that sat on the edge of a small rural community. Inside the house there was a television playing a muted sitcom. A few people were smoking cigarettes, a joint was passing between 2 hands, and the occasional laugh rose from the couch. The atmosphere felt ordinary, almost boring, and I could sense that the mescaline would not appreciate the mundane background. I rose from the couch and walked out the back door. The night outside was still, the grass glistening with dew. A large pond lay a short distance away, its surface smooth as glass. Doves floated above the water, occasionally dipping their heads to drink. The pond was surrounded by a low fence, and on the far side of the water a narrow strip of land stretched out to a small island. On the island there stood a wooden gazebo, its roof slanted, with a fire pit at its center. The gazebo reminded me of the pictures I had seen of shamanic circles, and I felt a strange pull toward it. Near the gazebo a wooden dock extended into the water, its boards creaking softly under the weight of the night breeze. I sat on the dock, letting the cool water lap at my shoes. My stomach began to churn. The mescaline was starting to work. I felt a wave of nausea rise up, and I quickly stood, walked back toward the house, and vomited into the kitchen sink. The taste was sour, but the mescaline itself seemed to stay with me, a heat building behind my eyes. At 11:15 I returned to the living room. My friends stared at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern. I did not meet their eyes. The room continued its low hum of conversation, the television still playing in the background. I felt a lightness in my limbs, as if my bones had become less dense. I slipped onto the tile floor behind the couch, moving with a fluid motion that reminded me of a cat. Amy was leaning against the couch, unaware of my presence. I crept up behind her, wrapped my arms around her waist, and whispered a quick apology. She laughed, a short, surprised sound, and brushed me off. The laughter felt like a ripple in a pond, spreading outward. The colors in the room began to shift. The white walls took on a faint amber glow. The green couch seemed to pulse with a soft teal light, and the television screen flickered with colors that were not part of any program. My perception of objects became layered, as if each item had a thin veil of light that moved independently of the object itself. The sound of the joint being passed around turned into a low hum that resonated in my chest. At midnight, the conversation turned toward deeper topics. Amy spoke about the idea that the universe is a single mind, and Tony added that ancient shamanic practices might be a way to tap into that mind. I found myself listening more than speaking, but my thoughts were moving quickly, jumping from one idea to the next. I could see the words forming in the air above each speaker, glowing briefly before fading. Tony suggested that we should leave the house and walk home. The idea of walking 5 miles in the night under the influence of mescaline seemed both terrifying and inviting. I felt a strong resistance to the suggestion. My inner voice told me that the night outside held something I needed to see. I told Tony that I would stay, that I would walk around the property instead. I stepped back onto the dock, and the water reflected the sky in a way that made the stars appear to be floating just a few feet above the surface. The colors of the night deepened. The reds of distant streetlights turned into a soft magenta. The blues of the sky became a deep indigo that seemed to breathe. I felt as though my vision was a liquid canvas, each hue blending into the next. The mescaline's effects grew stronger. Shapes in the darkness began to move. Shadows along the fence line stretched and contracted as if they were breathing. The gazebo on the island seemed to glow from within, a warm orange light spilling out of its windows. I imagined a small fire burning inside, though no fire was actually present. The thought of fire made me feel a sudden warmth in my chest, a comforting pressure that spread outward. I walked toward the gazebo, my steps slow and deliberate. The grass under my feet felt like a carpet of soft fibers, each blade sending a tiny electric pulse up my soles. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, a scent that reminded me of childhood hikes. As I approached the island, a flock of fireflies lit up the space around me, their lights blinking in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. When I reached the edge of the dock, I paused. The water below reflected the stars, but the reflection was not a perfect mirror. It rippled with a pattern that resembled a living tapestry of light. I felt a sudden urge to step into the water, to let the coolness wash over my legs. I lowered my shoes and let the water touch my ankles. The sensation was immediate and sharp, a shock that sent a jolt up my spine. The water was colder than I expected, and the contrast between the warmth of my body and the chill of the pond made me shiver. I stood there, half in the water, half on the dock, and let the mescaline take over my perception. The pond seemed to breathe with me, expanding and contracting in time with my inhalations. The sky above the pond turned a deep violet, and the stars began to smear into long streaks, as if they were being pulled across a canvas by an invisible hand. I could feel the edges of my thoughts softening, the hard lines of logic blurring into a more fluid state. At one point, I heard a faint rustle behind me. I turned to see a small raccoon emerging from the brush, its eyes reflecting the violet sky. The animal stared at me for a moment, then scurried away, leaving a trail of disturbed leaves. I felt a sudden connection to the creature, as if we shared a brief understanding of the night's secret. The mescaline continued to rise, and my sense of time stretched. Minutes felt like hours, and the night seemed to expand outward, filling the space around me. I could hear the distant hum of a tractor on a neighboring farm, but the sound was muffled, as if it were coming from far beneath the earth. The hum blended with the chirping of crickets, creating a low, rhythmic pulse that resonated in my chest. I decided to sit on the edge of the dock, legs dangling over the water. The night air brushed against my skin, and I felt a gentle pressure on my shoulders, as if someone invisible was placing a hand there. I closed my eyes for a moment, and when I opened them again, the world had shifted. The colors were brighter, the sounds clearer, the sensations more vivid. I could see the outlines of the trees behind the house as if they were made of translucent glass, each leaf a tiny pane catching the violet light. Amy called my name from inside the house. Her voice sounded distant, like a bell ringing far away. I did not answer. I felt a pull toward the gazebo, as if the glowing light inside was inviting me to step inside. I stood, brushed the water from my shoes, and walked across the narrow strip of land that connected the dock to the island. The wooden planks creaked under my weight, each sound echoing in the still night. When I stepped onto the island, the gazebo's interior was illuminated by a soft amber glow. There was no fire, but the light seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Inside, a circle of stones lay on the floor, each stone humming faintly. I walked toward the circle, feeling the ground beneath my feet vibrate with a low frequency. The air inside the gazebo felt warm, despite the night outside being cool. I placed my hands on one of the stones. The stone was smooth, cool to the touch, and as I pressed my palm against it, a wave of sensation traveled up my arm, spreading through my body. It felt as though the stone were a conduit, a bridge between my inner world and the outer night. The mescaline amplified this feeling, turning it into a sense of being rooted to the earth while simultaneously floating above it. I sat down on the stone circle, cross-legged, and let the night surround me. The stars above seemed to swirl, forming patterns that I could not name. I felt a gentle pull toward the center of the circle, as if an invisible force wanted me to focus my attention there. I breathed in deeply, feeling the cool night air fill my lungs, and exhaled slowly, watching the breath leave my body as a faint mist. The mescaline was now fully present. My thoughts were no longer linear. They moved like water flowing over rocks, sometimes smooth, sometimes turbulent. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves as a wind brushed the tops of the pines surrounding the stone circle. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time, as if the forest itself were breathing. My eyes remained fixed on the center of the stone, the dark patch of earth that now glowed with a soft inner light. The light was not a flame but a gentle pulse, like the beat of a heart that I could feel through my skin. With each inhalation the pulse grew brighter. With each exhalation it softened, and the rhythm matched the rhythm of my own breathing. The mescaline had pushed my perception beyond the ordinary limits of sight and sound. Colors that I had never known before appeared in the darkness. A deep indigo swirled into a bright teal, then dissolved into a shimmering gold that seemed to ripple across the sky. The stars above were no longer distant points of light. They were moving, breathing entities that stretched and contracted as if they were alive. I felt a pull toward the center of the circle, as if the stone were a magnet drawing my attention inward. I lifted my hands and placed them on the cool stone. The surface was rough, the ancient grit of weathered granite biting into my fingertips. A warmth spread from the points of contact up my arms, traveling to my shoulders, to my neck, and finally to the back of my head. It was as if the stone were transmitting a current of energy directly into my nervous system. I could feel the current travel through my veins, lighting up each cell with a faint electric buzz. My thoughts, which had already begun to flow like water, now moved in a series of quick, bright flashes. Images of childhood, of a time when I had chased fireflies in a backyard, appeared and disappeared in rapid succession. Each image was accompanied by a scent: wet earth after rain, the sharp tang of pine sap, the sweet perfume of night-blooming jasmine. The peak of the experience arrived suddenly, like a wave that broke against a cliff. The world around me seemed to dissolve into a single, all-encompassing presence. I was no longer separate from the stone, the night, the forest, or the stars. I was part of a larger pattern that stretched beyond the horizon. The sensation was not frightening. It was a deep, profound sense of belonging. My heart beat slowly, each thump resonating through my chest like a drum. My breath was steady, each inhale filling my lungs with cool night air that smelled of pine and damp moss. In the middle of this peak I heard a voice, not a spoken word, but a feeling that seemed to come from the very air. It was gentle and patient, urging me to observe rather than judge. I felt my mind let go of the need to label or explain. The voice asked me to notice the way the light moved across the stone, the way the wind whispered through the leaves, the way the stars twinkled in a pattern that resembled a living circuit. I watched the pattern shift, and with each shift a new color emerged, a new tone entered the night. The colors were not just visual, they had a texture. The teal felt smooth, like the surface of a calm lake. The gold felt warm, like sunlight on skin. The indigo felt deep, like the bottom of a well. My friends, Amy and Tony, were still nearby, though their presence seemed distant, as if they were silhouettes against a faraway backdrop. I could sense their thoughts, not in words but in feelings. Amy's mind was filled with curiosity, a gentle wonder that matched the night's own mystery. Tony's mind was restless, his thoughts flickering like a candle in a draught. I sensed his anxiety, and without speaking, I offered him a sense of calm. The feeling spread to him, and I saw his shoulders relax, his breathing even out. In that moment I realized that the mescaline had given me a temporary ability to share emotional states without words. The plateau followed the peak like a slow tide receding from the shore. The intensity of the colors began to soften, the brightness dimmed, but the sense of connection remained. I felt my body settle into the stone, the coolness of the granite grounding me. The wind continued its gentle dance, now carrying a faint chorus of night insects. Their chirps formed a rhythm that matched the slow pulse of the stone's light. I could hear the faint hum of a distant owl, its call echoing through the trees. The sound seemed to vibrate through the ground, resonating with the same frequency as the stone's inner glow. During this plateau, I turned my attention inward, examining the thoughts that still floated like leaves on a stream. I noticed a pattern of recurring doubts that had followed me for years, questions about purpose, about the value of my work, about relationships that felt strained. The mescaline allowed these doubts to surface without the usual defensive barriers. I watched them as if they were clouds passing across a sky, noting their shape, their movement, and then letting them drift away. In their place, a sense of clarity emerged. I realized that many of my worries were rooted in expectations that I had placed on myself, expectations that were not aligned with my true desires. I felt a sudden urge to move, to walk beyond the stone circle and explore the surrounding forest. The urge was not driven by curiosity alone. It felt like a need to integrate the experience with the physical world. I rose slowly, feeling the stone's cool surface against my bare feet, and stepped onto the soft grass that surrounded the circle. The grass brushed against my calves, each blade cool and slightly damp from the night's humidity. I walked toward the pond that lay a short distance away, its surface reflecting the moon in a silver ribbon. As I approached the water, I saw the doves that had been perched on the edge of the pond earlier. They were now gliding silently across the water, their wings creating ripples that spread outward. I felt a deep sense of peace watching them. The water itself seemed to pulse with a faint inner light, matching the rhythm of the stone's glow. I knelt at the edge and placed my hands in the water. The cold shocked my skin, sending a jolt of alertness through my body. The shock quickly turned into a soothing sensation, as if the water were washing away the remnants of the peak's intensity. The come-down began as the night grew older and the temperature dropped. The colors that had once been vivid now appeared muted, like an old photograph that had lost its saturation. The stone's inner glow dimmed to a soft amber, and the stars above seemed to settle into a steady, familiar pattern. My thoughts slowed, moving from rapid flashes to a steady stream. I found myself reflecting on the images that had appeared during the peak. The fireflies of my childhood, the pine sap, the jasmine, all of them seemed to hold a memory of a time when I felt more connected to the natural world. I felt a gentle fatigue settle into my muscles. My legs, which had carried me across the pond and through the forest, began to ache slightly, as if they had been walking for miles. My shoulders relaxed, the tension that had built up over months of work and stress releasing in small, quiet sighs. I sat down on a fallen log near the water's edge, allowing the night sounds to fill the space around me. The chirping insects formed a soft percussion, the rustle of leaves a gentle accompaniment, and the distant hoot of an owl a low bass note. During the come-down, I thought about the conversation I had had earlier with Amy and Tony. Their voices, though distant, echoed in my mind. Amy had spoken about the interconnectedness of all things, repeating a phrase that had become a mantra for the night. I am he and we are she and she is me and we are all together. The phrase resonated with me, not because of its literal meaning, but because it captured the feeling of unity that the mescaline had revealed. Tony, who had been uneasy earlier, had eventually joined in, his voice trembling at first but then gaining confidence. Their shared chant seemed to bind us together, even as the physical distance grew. I realized that the mescaline had not only opened my perception, but also amplified the emotional currents that already existed among us. The shared chant acted like a bridge, allowing us to feel each other's inner states without the need for words. I felt a deep gratitude for the experience, for the way it had allowed me to see the hidden threads that linked my friends, the stone, the forest, and the night sky. The night began to thin as the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon. A pale pink light seeped into the sky, turning the stars a soft violet before they faded completely. The stone's glow faded with them, leaving only the natural dimness of early morning. I felt a slight chill in the air, and my breath became visible in thin wisps. I stood slowly, feeling the stiffness in my joints, and began to make my way back toward the house where Amy and Tony were waiting. When I reached the doorway, I found Amy seated on a couch, her eyes half closed, a small smile on her lips. Tony was leaning against the wall, his posture relaxed, his eyes reflecting the faint light from the street lamp outside. They both looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and relief. I could sense that they had been watching me, waiting for me to return from the forest. I took a seat beside Amy, feeling the soft cushion beneath me, and placed my hand on the back of Tony's chair. The contact was grounding, a reminder that I was again part of the physical world. We spoke in low tones, each of us sharing what we had felt. Amy described a vision of a river that flowed backward, carrying away old memories. Tony spoke of a feeling of being caught in a storm, but then finding a calm center within it. I told them about the stone's pulse, the colors, the sense of being part of a larger pattern. We did not try to analyze the visions. We simply named them, allowing the words to settle like stones in a stream. The after effects of the mescaline lingered for several hours after the night had ended. My mind remained clear, but the usual chatter was quieter, as if a filter had been placed over it. I noticed details that I would normally overlook, the way the morning light painted the edges of the trees with a golden halo, the faint scent of damp earth after a night rain, the subtle creak of the house settling as the temperature changed. My body felt light, as if a weight that had been pressing on my shoulders had been lifted. My muscles, though still a little sore from the walk, felt more pliable, more responsive. I found myself moving through the day with a slower, more deliberate pace. I prepared a simple breakfast of toast and coffee, and each bite seemed to carry a richness that I had not noticed before. The coffee's bitterness was balanced by a sweet aftertaste, and I savored it, feeling the warmth travel down my throat to my stomach. As I ate, I thought about the night's journey and the images that had surfaced. The fireflies, the river flowing backward, the stone's pulse, all of these symbols seemed to point toward a theme of release. The night had shown me that many of the things I held onto were not essential, that they could be let go without loss. Later in the afternoon, I walked outside to the porch and sat on the steps, watching the world move around me. A neighbor's dog trotted by, its tail wagging, its ears perked up at every sound. A car passed slowly down the road, its tires humming on the pavement. I felt a sense of calm that was not dependent on the mescaline, but rather on the insight that the experience had given me. I realized that the feeling of unity I had experienced was not a magical state that could only be reached through chemicals. It was a natural part of being human, accessible when I allowed myself to notice it. In the evening, I wrote down the details of the night in a notebook, trying to capture the sequence of sensations, images, and emotions. I noted the colors, the sounds, the tactile sensations, and the shifts in my internal state.